Hi there, this is Lecher from Lecher Films, and welcome to the alphabet of my favourite films, and this video is for the letter E. Now there's not actually that many, there's only 8 films, and again, please let me know in the comments which ones I've missed, because there'll either be ones I've forgotten about, or ones I haven't seen, either for years or just haven't seen at all. And I always enjoy reading your lists. So hopefully this won't be a very long video, you'll be glad to hear. So the first one is Ed Wood by Tim Burton. For me, this is Tim Burton's best film by the proverbial country mile. It's kind of his least known because it's in black and white, and it was made about, historically, the world's worst film director, Ed Wood Jr., even though everybody knows it's probably Michael Bay. And you can tell that this is a project that Tim Burton is invested in. You can tell it's a project that Tim Burton loves, and that love and adoration for the subject matter really comes through. It's arguably Johnny Depp's finest Tim Burton performance in one of his finest period, because it has that kind of happy, gleeful, almost manic optimism that the next film he makes is going to be, you know, the greatest film of all time. He was inspired by Citizen Kane, but talent wise maybe wasn't in the same league as Orson Welles. And it just follows Ed Wood Jr.'s kind of adventures trying to get films made, and his friendship with Bela Lugosi, who was at the end of his career and was a morphine addict. Bela Lugosi is played by Martin Landau, who he won the Oscar for it, I believe. But there's brilliant supporting turns by Sarah Jessica Parker, Mike Starr, Bill Murray, amongst many others. And it's just an absolute joy, but it is also quite sad and tragic. But it's just so beautifully put together. It is a real love letter to low budget cinema, and a kind of love letter to people that have passion for filmmaking but might not necessarily have the talent, but their optimism and joy for the craft and the creative process is worth celebrating. For me, it's one of those films that's almost perfect. It's just an absolute joy. So that's first on the list, Ed Wood. Next on the list, not that I'm biased or anything, it's 8 Men Out by John Sayles. One of the few John Sayles films you can actually get on Blu-ray. This is a Region A by Olive Films. And this is John Sayles' look at the 1919 Chicago White Sox, or they became known as the Black Sox, for allegedly throwing the World Series. For a film that only made, or was only made for, a couple of $1 million, the film looks absolutely beautiful. The period detail is just fabulous. It has a great cast: John Cusack, D.B. Sweeney, Michael Rooker. John Sayles himself plays a shady newspaper man. David Strathairn, of course. Almost forgot David Strathairn. Charlie Sheen, Christopher Lloyd, Michael Lerner, Clifton James. The music by Mason Daring, as quite a lot of John Sayles films are. And I would really recommend picking this one up because it's got a Sayles commentary. And John Sayles commentaries are worth their weight in gold as far as pretty much how to make a low budget film. And this film really shows how professional sport has changed since those days. The players at the time were being paid pennies by the owner, played by Clifton James, the famous Comiskey, owner of the Chicago White Sox. They were being paid a pittance while he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars off their success. So it doesn't really take much for a couple of the players to take some money from gamblers to perhaps throw a few games. It starts off as one or two players, and then more and more players get involved, and they end up losing the World Series. Spoiler alert. And it's just the impact of that on their careers, and they have the court hearing where they weren't really found guilty, but to clean up baseball they pretty much were all banned for life, including shoeless Joe Jackson, who obviously appears as Ray Liotta in Field of Dreams, who certainly was never proven that shoeless Joe Jackson had anything to do with it, but he get banned along with all the other players. And the end is really quite moving. It's essentially a film about lost innocence, I guess, because baseball was always seen as America's game, the national pastime, an innocent game of bat and ball, whereas that got changed and corrupted. And the last scene of the film is really quite moving because it's about a lost time. Maybe that age never really existed in reality, but it is just a lovely kind of farewell card to that kind of time and those kind of feelings. It might not be Sayles' best film, but it's really, really good. And like I said, it's got a wonderful ensemble cast. So if you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking it out. Now the next film is almost like a quintessential cult film. It's a Lecher Glade in Blue. This is from 1970 something. 1971, does that say? 1971, 1973, something like that. It's not a perfect film. It is one of those cult films, starring Robert Blake as a motorcycle cop who's bored and has dreams of being a detective, and one day he stumbles over an apparent suicide of this old man in a cabin, and he gets embroiled in a potential murder case, and for a short period of time he gets kind of promoted to detective, and he works alongside his kind of hero, this local hero detective. But as usual, when you meet your idols, it's somewhat of a disappointment. And he ends up being put back to a motorcycle cop. It has one of the greatest final shots in cinema history. It has a real feel for the 70s, the kind of the free spirit kind of hippie movement, if you want, against the man and authority. It features a short, brief appearance by young Nick Nolte, and it has a real kind of messy unruliness to it, as he becomes more disillusioned with what he thought his dream job would be and what his kind of hero would be. Obviously Robert Blake would appear in Cold Blood, which I think was before this, and then he would obviously appear as a very creepy man in David Lynch's Lost Highway, and then he went to prison for murdering a woman. I'm not actually sure whether he died recently or whether he's still in prison, but it's just a lovely little 70s cult film. It's not perfect, but there's just something about it that I really like. So the next film is Evil Dead Part 2. The Evil Dead is an important film and a kind of influential film, but for me it's not nearly as fun as the sequel, which essentially is a remake, but instead of going for scares, Sam Raimi went for laughs and general oddness. Bruce Campbell obviously made his name in the Evil Dead series, and he gives a really subtle, understated performance in Evil Dead 2, or not. The jokes kind of come thick and fast. There's even one where Bruce Campbell cuts his hand off and then traps the roving hand in a tin with a book, Farewell to Arms. That's the level of the humour in the film, but there's just a rambunctious energy about it. Obviously the Evil Dead's been remade, which I haven't actually seen, but this just has a joy about it. Again, it's low budget. They pretty much did it by the seat of their proverbial pants. It's just a lovely little cabin in the woods film, and I think it still stands up pretty well all these years later. So the next is the list is a film that's misunderstood or just flat hated. It's The Exorcist 3. Those of us who know what they're talking about obviously love this film. For me, it's the best film in the Exorcist series. I know it's controversial. I've talked about the film before in my channel, and it's the same with Halloween. Halloween 3 is the best Halloween film. It's true. This is a Scream Factory edition, which has the best version possible. It's one of those films that the making of and subsequent release is really quite interesting. After the disaster that was John Boorman's Exorcist 2, The Heretic, the studio didn't really want to make an Exorcist film. So they let William Peter Blatty write and direct this film, which was originally going to be called Legion, which is a really creepy, scary, disturbing kind of supernatural serial killer film with George C. Scott. Again, it's funny, I'm not the biggest George C. Scott fan, but I have a ton of his films, and I generally really like all of the films that I've got of him. And they then changed their minds. The studio then changed their minds and wanted some exorcism in it. So they changed it to The Exorcist 3. They tacked on this bizarre exorcism scene at the end, just to have an exorcism scene in it because it's The Exorcist 3. And just butchered Blatty's vision. The Scream Factory has kind of a reassembled cut, but it's like on VHS quality. So it's one of those films that if you kind of search through the murk and through the darkness, you can kind of see what the film should have been. But as it is, the first 3/4 are just fantastic. The relationship between George C. Scott's detective, who's world-weary and cynical, and Ed Flanders' kind of quirky, sardonic priest, is just one of the great friendships in cinema. And it really goes to dark places. There's killings that are happening that are copycats to a killer that was executed, and he may or may not be in a psychiatric ward. Scott Wilson turns up as a very fidgety psychiatrist. Like the first 3/4 of the film are just so good. And even through the kind of poor quality of the re-edit, there is a gem of a film in here, but it's kind of been ignored and forgotten about as the years go by, and it's a shame because it's an absolute corker. It's really creepy, really disturbing, and really good. So the next one is Atamagoyen's Exotica, which is another one of Egoyan's almost mystical, twisty, turny, we're all joined by different threads. Its central core is around the characters in a strip club. There's a young stripper, the madame of the strip club, and Elias Koteas's DJ. And Bruce Greenwood, who comes to the strip club to spend time with the young stripper, but he has different motives. He also has a babysitter, but he doesn't actually have any children for her to babysit. There's also a guy who runs an aquarium who may be involved in smuggling eggs into the country, and they're all kind of interlinked. Granted, when everything kind of unravels, it might not be that kind of much of a bombshell, but again, Egoyan, and with Michael Diana, the score, who scored quite a lot of Egoyan films, it just, if you go with it and go with the journey, it's a sumptuous, really shady trip, with lovely pastel colours and frescoes of the jungle and the strip club, and people watching other people through, hidden walls and stuff like that. It's a beautiful film. Some people might not have patience for it, but if you go with it, it really is quite a beautiful little film. So we're on to the second last one, which you'll be glad to hear. And it's Lisbon Ales' The Exterminating Angel. This is the Criterion Region A Blu-ray. And I think this might be my favourite Buñuel. It's essentially about a group of upper middle class people who hold a dinner party, but they can't actually get out of the room once the dinner party's finished, and they resort to things like having sex or finding God or rejecting God and worshipping Satan, to killing people. It's another one of Buñuel's playful pokes at the middle classes. Again, there's no explanation made, which obviously if it was made, I was going to say if it was made by Hollywood, but Hollywood would never make a film like The Exterminating Angel. But if it was made in a different period, there'd be some reason for it given, but there's no reason for it, and it's just a dark delight. It's shot beautifully. It's just a gorgeous film. Again, there's not a lot of plot points to talk about without you experiencing it, and how the film resolves itself, and Buñuel still getting the last laugh. It's just an exquisite piece of filmmaking. And finally, Georges Franju's Eyes Without Face, or Les Yeux Sans Visage, which is absolutely beautiful. This BFI edition I would recommend, because you also get Blood of the Beasts, which is a really interesting documentary about a slaughterhouse, which appears as though you don't actually have. I'll have to apologise, you don't actually get Blood of the Beasts. Where have I get Blood of the Beasts? I must have Blood of the Beasts on something, another format. I apologise. Eyes Without Face, it has really good extras, just not Blood of the Beasts. This film has been remade countless times under different titles. Peter Cushing is in a film called Corruption, which is set in the swinging 60s. I think Pedro Almodovar did a kind of version of it with Antonio Banderas. It's the simple story of a plastic surgeon whose daughter loses her face in a car accident, and with the help of his assistant, played by Alida Valli, the wonderful Alida Valli, he essentially kidnaps young women and tries to put their face on his daughter's face. Now, under the tutelage of another film director, this would be sleazy and nasty, but there's such a beautiful measured pacing to the film and a rhythm to the film. It really is an odd, poetic film. His daughter was played by Edith Scobe, who I think recently died in the past few months, and she wears this mask, this plain mask, which is quite creepy. There are points in the film where you think there's going to be a cutaway. I mean, this was made in 1958, and you keep thinking there's going to be a cutaway, and there's no cutaway, which is really quite shocking. This is one of the films I like to put up against Psycho as being way better. Psycho was made in 60, this was 58, Peeping Tom was 60, Le Diabolique was 55, but enough about that. It's just so beautiful. There is a poetic sense. It's almost like a strange fairy tale. It's almost like a grim fairy tale. It's a kind of statement about our obsession with beauty. It's also a statement about cinema itself, as far as the idea of beauty and the face being the most important thing. And apart from that, it's just a rollicking good thriller. Alida Valli has this really strange, creepy, forced smile on her face at times during the film, and then you actually find out that he was quite successful putting a new face on her. It's a really beautiful film that stands up now 60 years later. It's just so good. Les yeux, son visage. Absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know in the comments whether you agree, disagree, and what your list of your favourite films beginning with the letter E. And hopefully we will see you for the letter F. This is Solitude Owen saying thank you so much for watching and have a good evening.